everyone, and welcome back to the last lecture of Unit 2. Today we're going to be looking at life as a prison inmate while living in a prison facility. This is different than everything else we have discussed so far because this is often a long-term situation in which inmates are incarcerated for long periods of time. Prisons are full of long-term offenders who are getting older by the day and who have been locked away from the outside world and from family members and loved ones. This chapter explores inmate life and behavior while they are incarcerated. Let's go ahead and get started exploring this topic. Prisons are correctional facilities that house convicted felons for lengthy periods of time, usually longer than 1 year. There are different security levels in terms of what inmates are housed in which facilities. Trustees are normally classified as the lowest security risk inmates, and on the high end we have maximum security inmates and death row inmates who are supervised very strongly. County jails are often located in urban or suburban areas, typically in a downtown type space. This is important for proximity purposes. The courts need to be able to move jail inmates back and forth quickly. It needs to happen within a short distance so that the courts are not wasting time shuffling inmates back and forth. There is no issue, or similar issue rather, with prison inmates. Instead, prisons are often located in remote areas where there is a lot of land. Some prisons can house thousands of inmates, so they need the room to be able to have a large building. On the flip side, having prisons in remote areas often makes it difficult for family members and friends to visit. Typically, most inmates never receive any visitors after the first 3 years. Often these prisons involve a long trip to drive somewhere, and after a while trips become much more infrequent. Therefore, after a while, inmates are literally on their own. There is this line of thinking that if you commit a serious enough crime to be sentenced to prison, then you should deserve for it to be an often unpleasant experience. We are going to deprive you of everything that brings you comfort and essentially deprive you of anything you enjoy for however long that you're in prison. But what we're learning from research and from other countries is that this line of thinking is just simply not working. Think of what happens when we punish children. If you instill a harsh punishment on a child and do not make any attempts to reform the behavior of the child, then what do you think is going to happen? The behavior gets worse because of the severity of the punishment, doesn't it? The same thing is true for prison inmates. If you punish inmates harshly, just to say that you're being harsh, what do you think the outcome of that action will be on the behavior of the prison inmate? Other countries, more specifically Sweden, are showing signs of reform due to their efforts to rehabilitate rather than to simply punish. Their numbers are a lot lower than ours because of the sentencing structure that exists there and with the level of rehabilitative efforts that they put in place for their inmates. Sweden is actually so effective at rehabilitating offenders that they're really closing prisons down because they don't have enough inmates to fill their prisons. Could you even imagine a story like that running in the United States? While we are building more prisons to try and contain the overflow of prison inmates, Sweden is actually doing the exact opposite, and they're closing down their prisons. Over in Sweden, there is no such thing as life without parole. Life sentences can be petitioned after 10 years, and they're often overturned. There is some maneuverability within the system that doesn't exist here. Now, I understand the flip side of the argument. The United States and Sweden are culturally very different. However, human nature isn't all that different after all. If you don't strip someone down of everything that they know and that you make the stay somewhat comfortable, I'm not saying luxurious, but somewhat comfortable, then you're able to make changes within the individual. Now, we're not saying that you have to make it a stay in a luxurious hotel, but you might not need to be as starkly uncomfortable as U.S. prisons currently are. Take a look at this. This slide shows a photo of a maximum security prison located in Sweden. This looks absolutely, totally different than something you would expect to see in a U.S. prison, doesn't it? This almost looks as though it could be a college dorm room for a student like yourself. This is not the most comfortable place to be in the world, but you can see that the inmate does have a small TV, They would have some reading materials, a vanity bathroom with a toilet located somewhere inside, and a twin-size bed. However, if you make it a battleground and you force inmates into fighting over phone privileges, over items from the commissary, over books, or any other little trinket of comfort, then you're not going to be able to rehabilitate them because they're just trying to maintain and to survive. But by giving them some comfort and some control, not a lot, mind you, they're still in prison, but by giving them some freedom, it helps them to go through the system a little easier. By not denying them some level of comfort, we're seeing Swedish prisons actually succeed in keeping inmates from returning to their prisons. We're seeing Sweden close prisons, and we're seeing our inmates recidivate at much higher levels. Some get it. The ones that never want to go back to prison are going to change. First-time offenders are more likely to straighten out than repeat offenders. However, not everyone is going to straighten out and correct their behavior. For the other 70% of inmates who are not corrected in their behavior while incarcerated, we see them recidivating at high amounts, and they're often becoming revolving door offenders. This has to do a lot with the amount of freedom and control that occurs in a prison environment. Too much social control and the inmate will not be receptive to change. Instead, you will see individuals bulking back against the system if they're controlled too strictly. Recidivism is highly correlated with incarceration. The environment that inmates find themselves in, it's very harsh and often very unforgiving. Simple exposure to this type of environment often makes the situation worse. Prisons are tough places to live in. Since there is limited availability of luxury items, inmates can be ruthless in trying to protect their property and their status within this prison. This attempt to protect what is important to them can lead to antisocial behavior, it can often exacerbate anger problems, and it often leads to higher rates of criminality. When the inmate gets out of prison, he or she is so used to life on the inside that they don't know how to readapt to life on the outside. One of the best examples of inmate behavior and the exacerbation of antisocial behaviors is the Scared Straight program. As you may be aware, we have used the Scared Straight program, or similar versions of it, since the 1980s, and research has confirmed that it does not work. If you have a troubled youth who is on their way to becoming an adult offender who is constantly getting into trouble with the law, throwing them into such a shocking environment that is prison doesn't do anything to stop the youth's behavior. Instead, the minor tends to not take it seriously or wrongfully thinks they're strong enough to make it inside the prison. Some minors even think that they'd be able to thrive in that environment. If you've ever watched the new version of the show on A&E, you often see follow-up interviews with the minors after they leave the program. In every episode, there are always several from that episode that report having gone to jail within months of going through the program. Research suggests that programs like this one are ineffective and tend to make the situation worse. Like the DARE program that targets drug prevention, these kids who went through Scared Straight programs end up being incarcerated at higher frequencies than those who don't go through the same program at all. So I want to switch gears a little bit now, and I want to talk about some more recent prison population numbers and trends that we've been seeing in this country. As I started the semester out, we know that the total correctional system is over 70 million customers strong. Only about 2.3 million of those individuals are incarcerated, whereas the remainder of them are out on some sort of community level supervision. But even though only 2.3 million are incarcerated, we tend to see an incarceration rate that is climbing steadily, but might not necessarily be reflective of the overall crime rate in this country. I ask you why you think this might be. Take a look at this chart. The blue line on the chart is reflective of the crime rate, and the red line is reflective of the overall incarceration rate. You will see that I marked two red arrows on the chart, which are marked around, let's say, the 1980-1985 range. If you remember from the Chapter 4 lecture, something significant happened in 1984 that changed the way we sentenced people. I want you all to remember what that year marked and the definitive change that took place. I'm not going to give you the answer, but I want you guys to either remember it or try and find it. After you identify or remember that event, try to interpret what this intersection might mean. How would that landmark event force the incarceration rate to climb while the crime rate decreased? This slide shows the total frequency and how often we incarcerate individuals. The United States as a whole incarcerates more inmates than any other country in the rest of the world. We incarcerate more inmates than the Russian Federation, than the Ukraine, than Iran, than Brazil, than China. Now, I know what you're thinking, as I get the same argument every time I teach this class. Some of these countries, like China, have a lower incarceration rate than we do because they just simply execute all of their offenders. This is true to an extent, but we are one of the largest countries in the world in terms of the world population size, and we have nearly 4% of our country under some sort of correctional supervision. The odds get even worse when you break down the chances of incarceration by gender and by race. This slide shows a series of statistics for the likelihood of being incarcerated during your lifetime. As you can see, the results are rather bleak and just absolutely seriously troubling. If you are a black man in this country, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated. 1 in 3 black men will be incarcerated at some point during their life. If that does not trouble you, then something is wrong. This statistic is so overwhelming and reflective of a race-injected system that it makes it nearly impossible for minority offenders to make it out. As you probably would expect, white offenders, regardless of race, tend to have the lowest rates of incarceration. And additionally, women as a gender are less likely to be incarcerated than men are. We will discuss gender differences present in the criminal justice system when we make it to our Women in Corrections chapter over in Unit 3. Like jail inmates, prison inmates arrive at the facility with a variety of medical issues that often get worse as time goes on due to a lack of treatment comparable to what you would receive on the outside. Plus, there is ample opportunity to engage in vices while inside prison walls themselves. If I am in a smoking prison per se, I can still smoke. Cigarettes are often used as a bartering system for inmates. They're often a source of income. Prostitution and high-risk sexual behaviors still occur even though the correctional officers don't want to acknowledge it. But without the necessary protection against these vice behaviors, I might just be passing everything from inmate to inmate. But if I am a health concern while I'm in prison, eventually I might get out. And when I do get out, I will be bringing those issues with me on the outside. Let's say I caught hepatitis from another inmate while incarcerated. I'm going to leave prison with hepatitis, and I'm going to expose my kids and my spouse to that disease. Many returning inmates do not have access to adequate medical care on the outside, let alone insurance, and often their medical problems get worse. Prison is a hard environment and it ages you very quickly. Inmates who enter prison are often young and fresh-faced. When they leave a few years later, they look like they've aged overnight. I like to compare this process to the progression of presidential photos. Have you ever seen on the news when the media puts a side-by-side shot of the president when they first took office compared to the end of their first year? Often there is a significant amount of gray in their hair, wrinkles are starting to become more pronounced. Well, the same thing occurs for prison inmates. When you are in such a high-stress environment for even such a short amount of time, you tend to age much faster than you do without that stressor in your life. One of the biggest downsides to determinate sentencing is that no one is going home. Inmates are not leaving prison for a very long time. They're now becoming elderly men and women who in no way resemble the young person who committed a serious crime in their youth. But their sentence has not expired and parole is not an option for many, so they're just aging in prison and the taxpayers are left paying for it. Inmates age significantly faster than their counterparts outside. In prison, inmates are considered elderly when they hit 55 rather than the standard of 65 outside of prison. Elderly inmates are actually a very large problem. Because of the ever-increasing prison sentences, people are staying for longer in prison. Some inmates are quite old and are still incarcerated. Prison is also a much harder lifestyle. A 60-year-old inmate might be equivalent to a 70 or 75-year-old free man in terms of medical problems, which is one of the reasons why the threshold for what is considered elderly is much lower for prisons. Like regular elderly inmates, there are a lot of healthcare concerns, and money is needed to keep these individuals incarcerated. It increases the amount of money that we need every year in comparison to a much healthier, younger inmate. Prisons have to treat elderly inmates who have diabetes or cancers or other illnesses that are a result of hard living on the outside of the diseases that they're bringing in with them. This is a drain on budgetary and personnel resources, but states are required to provide adequate medical care coverage to these inmates, as it is unconstitutional to not treat any illnesses of any variety while the inmates are in prison. Currently, we have about 14 times more elderly inmates than we did in 1981, and we're going to continue to grow that number as we increase into the future. We have a much larger population of individuals getting older. There are a lot of baby boomers in prison right now, and they're continuing to get older as the years go on. The same concern exists for them that we have for baby boomers on the outside. Are there going to be enough resources to help them stay healthy as they age? One of the things that we have to be concerned about, in addition to health resources, is the amount of money that is needed to keep them incarcerated. If I'm getting older and I need dialysis, or I need cancer treatments, or I need whatever other medical treatments that I need, the state is going to have to pick up that cost. Some states are starting separate wings or even entirely separate facilities that incarcerate only 55 plus inmates. You have to have them all on the first floor, or you have to have wheelchair ramps, or you have to have on-site medics, etc. But here's a good question that I pose to you. What happens when you have an inmate with Alzheimer's? How will that inmate remember where their cell is? What happens if they're not lucid and cannot remember why they're in prison to begin with? Correctional officers and staff are now having to be trained in working with and supervising such inmates so that they're not harmed by other inmates and they're not scared. And this is often a very overwhelming thing when the inmate does have issues like dementia that they have to deal with. One of the things that some states are implementing are laws called compassionate release laws. These are put into effect when the inmate is terminal and is about to pass away. There are some regulations that must be put in place in order to make sure that the inmate meets the qualifications for compassionate release before they're just let out of prison. However, because the qualifications are so strict, compassionate release or medical parole is often rarely used. Texas compassionate release laws are medical parole laws. They release the inmate, but this only applies when the inmate is terminally ill or is ready to die. A medical parole board votes on whether or not the inmate should be released and whether or not there is a support system at home that is able to care for and pay for the care of the inmate before he or she dies. The catch to these laws rests in the idea that if the inmate improves or if the illness is stabilized, then the inmate must return to prison. And this is not a one shot and you're out. You have to die in order to not be returned to prison. If you are returned to prison, that is very unlikely that you will ever be released on medical parole again. There are so many hoops to jump through that very few inmates even successfully get released this way before they die. The ACLU actually did a cost-benefit analysis to determine how much money would be saved if states started letting out aging inmates early. The ACLU estimated that releasing elderly inmates with only limited health problems, meaning things that are common in old age, would save the state around $28,000 per inmate per year. Releasing an elderly inmate with moderate health issues would save the state around $66,000 a year per inmate, and releasing an elderly inmate with larger health issues, things like cancer or diabetes or other terminal types of diseases, would save us about $104,000 per inmate per year in the costs that are associated with supervising and treating the inmate's medical needs. The large downside to this program is that many inmates do not have the necessary support systems to return home to. After spending 20 or 30 or more years in prison, family members have disappeared, or they may have passed away on their own, and the inmate is often left to die in prison without that support system at home. On a much more cheerful note, I want to present you with another opportunity to watch an outside video clip for this class. Like I did earlier in the semester, I posted a YouTube link on Blackboard for a clip from the TV show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. I have posted another one here for you so that you can see his commentary about the prison system in America. This, like the other one, is a very good piece, just like the last one was. Please do go onto the Blackboard page to watch the video clip that I'm referring to, but once again, this does come from HBO, so that comes with the profanity that is allowed on that show. Just a heads up. Okay, in this lecture, we spent some time focusing on what life is like for a prison inmate. It's often a harsh environment that is difficult to maneuver for many. Many inmates are just trying to survive and maintain what little comforts that they are allowed. And losing those comforts can often be devastated, and it increases the inmate's desire to be tough around the other inmates. But being in this stressful of an environment makes people harder. When they come out, there's no softness left, and pieces of their humanity have often been stripped away. If they come out, they are left trying to navigate a world that is so unlike the one that they left behind. Inmates who are serving long prison sentences now present a variety of new issues. As elderly inmates get older, states are often left trying to care for these individuals, which is a very, very costly, time-consuming process. This lecture ends the second unit. In the final lecture for the semester, or in the final unit of the semester, we're going to be looking at reentry, the issues that are presented by female prisoners and offenders, and then we're going to end the semester with a look at the ultimate punishment, the death penalty, and its use in the United States. So meet me back here next time when we begin Unit 3.